as I said a few weeks ago when I offered the first installment of this talk, I would continue speaking of relationship a bit more this summer. So here's the second installment. Um, we'll talk a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the understanding, the view that we want to bring to our practice. Make some room for some questions. I know there were some questions the last time that we didn't get to, and then we'll do a guided meditation to kind of help to work with it a little bit. So again, Shinzen Yang, I started this way the last time. Shinzen Yang says relationship is as the layperson's monastery. It's actually everybody's monastery. Ajahn Chah, who was an enlightened master, said that in his years of practice that he initially went off by himself into the mountains, into the forest, and practiced and achieved very high states of concentration and meditation, mindfulness, and was able to really discern, see very clearly what the Buddha's teachings were and how they worked. But what he realized was that when he would come down, if you will, from the forest into the monastery, that he very quickly got cranky. That being in relationship with other people was really showing him, if you will, the places where his practice wanted attention. And so he deliberately established the monasteries, the different monasteries, for that reason, so that people could kind of rub up against each other and really have an opportunity to look and see how the practice really works, not in some theoretical way, but how it really works. And so our relationships give us those opportunities every day. Could be relationships with people that we think about as relationships, maybe partners or family or children or parents or relatives, friends, co-workers. But it can be any kind of relationship. It can be relationship with the grumpy clerk who pours my coffee in the morning. Just how to relate to to just about everybody. Somebody on the other end of the marketing call, the person who cuts us off in traffic. Any kind of relationship is really what we're talking about. I asked you last time to talk together and to kind of write down places where you had some dukkha, or the word dukkha means stress or suffering, where there was some stress in your life in relationship. And it was, my heart was very tender as I read them, because all of us are struggling. All of us have relational stress. And so it was really very, very tender to read what you wrote. And I've summarized them. It would take a long time really to read them all, but I kind of summarized them into the kind of dukkha, the kind of relational stress that many of you reported. When I am ignored, unseen, blamed, lonely, misunderstood, misrepresented, not listened to, not respected. Ouch. When there's mental illness or disagreement or contention or division, rancor in the family or the city or the community or the workplace or the world. Ouch. Stress. Racism, sexism, homophobia, age discrimination, gender discrimination, addictions, injustices toward me and or in my family or the city or the world. with the news. Ouch. Financial, marriage, work, friendship, parenting stresses, just ordinary stresses. Illness, aging bodies and failing minds, my own, others. Impatience, overwhelm, thinking I'm right, thinking I'm wrong, thinking I know, being sure that I don't know. Ouch. Big long list that you offered. Nobody really had too much trouble finding relational stress. Not mentioned, actually, it was interesting, not mentioned or mentioned very, very seldom, was when the pleasant of relationship fades or changes or ends. Because even the pleasant has stress associated with it. You know, this beautiful day is gone. The daylilies. My daylilies, they only last a day, you know. Flowers fade, beloved people grow up. They leave, they move away. They die. We wake up tomorrow after a party or a vacation or a retirement, and just ordinary life goes on, you know. One of my relatives talks about so looking forward to retirement and then being incredibly bored, you know. You know. So the pleasant sometimes doesn't turn out to be quite what we wanted, or if it does, it ends. It ends. So, ouch. You can't hold on to even the pleasant. With respect to our children, children growing and changing, there can be sadness and loss. We can encourage our children to become independent, and then the experience of actually letting go can be very painful. I remember a friend speaking of how difficult it was. She had gotten so delighted with being a parent, and then had a second child, and the second child really changed everything. And you know how challenging that was, just the change, aside from any particular difficulties. Even things like great accomplishment. You've read of people who win the lottery or the Olympic medals. Michael Phelps talks very openly about becoming profoundly depressed after all of his Olympic medals. You know, all the excitement, all the wonder. Kittisaro speaks of actually starting his meditation practice when he realized he was a championship wrestler, and he realized that he had sort of gotten where he wanted to go, and it was sort of like, well, now what? He saw how ephemeral even the pleasant was, and wondered, now what? And it's really what the Buddha discovered, living in luxury, living in, just one of those houses in Architectural Digest, that the Buddha lived in this amazing, splendid place where everything was wonderful. And he realized that it didn't really bring him happiness. And so, it didn't really solve the problems of stress or solve the problems of difficulty. And so he discovered, as he started on his path, that it's not what happens that matters. It's not what happens that matters. It's not whether or not we're ignored, unseen, blamed, lonely, misunderstood, misrepresented, whether there's mental illness or disagreement or contention, or racism or sexism or homophobia or financial or marriage or work or friendship or it's not what matters, the Buddha discovered. It's not what happens, rather, that matters. It is in cultivating skill at being with what happens, seeing it clearly, being able to discern the cause of suffering and responding to our own experience initially with kindness and wisdom. And from that place, opening to more clarity about what might be needed. So a radical shift in awareness from, the way we ordinarily deal with all of this is like we have to fix it. To really looking first into our own experience with kindness and clarity and allowing that to unfold in a quiet heart, in spacious awareness, so that we can see clearly what, if anything, might be needed from me. Pretty radical shift, because it's not how we ordinarily think of things, is it? Even in my morning coffee, I can watch the impulse. I need to cheer them up, So I need to kind of fix this out there, which might be something useful, but again, it's not the first move. It's not the first move. So our practice, when we sit on our cushions, our practice is actually practice for cultivating the ability to inquire in that way. And at first, it cannot, we can be really puzzled. The Buddha invites us to not be lost in delusion or lethargy or hopelessness, but to cultivate a quiet heart, an awake heart that's alive, that's vibrant in the real world, seeing, knowing the ups and downs of life with discernment and wisdom, knowing impermanence, knowing how little control we have over things, but not caught or lost in suffering. At peace with how things are in the present moment, this moment opening into wise and wholesome response. So it's not so everything will be nice, but a spacious awareness that points to what is true and what is needed. And we've all had those moments of spacious awareness when we see clearly. But nevertheless, when we consider our own relationships, and we think, I don't think that's right, or we consider, the state of the world or the state of politics or, that just kind of being with my own experience, really? Can that possibly be right? So I wanted to pause there. We didn't have time for any questions last time, and just see if there are any questions that are cooking up, any observations, any wonderments, curiosities that you might have so far. Anybody want to ask anything or wonder out loud about something about that? Or object? Yeah, Charlotte, here. Can you take this? Thank you.
I think it's really interesting to think about what you said about the coffee server, and that you want to fix it and make her happy and make this, but well, is that right? And maybe she just wants to be quiet, and if not, maybe not grumpy, but maybe just this is her way. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the kind of stepping back and thinking about it that I think is really useful. That trying to make her the way you want her to be,
right,
is.
Right.
I love that you pointed that out. That's
right. And maybe we could notice ways that we try to make people in our lives the way we think they should be. People close to us, maybe people not so close to us. Yeah. Thank you, Charlotte. Anybody else want to make a question or an observation or objection? Or yeah, Sarah Beth? And then Liz. Mhm.
Sorry, I have a piece of Tootsie Roll in my mouth. I just wanted to mention this while we were on the subject of the coffee clerk. In Joan Halifax's book, Barbara suggested I read, there's a line that says, I watch, she's talking about someone who's dying. She's by the bedside. But she says, I watch what I want for her rise up in me and let it go with a breath. And I just think about how many things that applies to in my life. Watching what I want for someone else rise up in me
Beautiful.
and letting it go with a breath.
Wow. Nice. Thank you. Liz?
In the last retreat that I sat with you, I think I came to an understanding of, I've really had trouble with how much time I'm putting into my body with Alexander Technique, which is a thing I'm doing, because it feels so divorced from all the problems out there and so much time with me. And something Phyllis said, actually, your teaching
Co-teacher.
partner,
Mhm.
that something about how all the divisions out there are actually in us too, and that it's the same thing almost. Is that how I took it? I don't know exactly what she said.
I think she left out the almost.
Okay. But yeah, that's just
Yeah.
what
Uh-huh.
because I do feel I feel guilty for spending a lot of time with
Right.
me.
Right. It seems backwards, doesn't it? It seems wrong somehow. Yeah. And that's why the Buddha's teaching was so radical, that he said, nobody's going to understand this. You know, it's too hard. Yeah. Sue?
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this. What you're talking about, like, and what Liz talked about, like having time to yourself, and yet we're also with other people. And somebody has mentioned to me that I really need maybe to be more in like retreats or be more in silence to myself, with myself. And I'm noticing that maybe those opportunities are coming to me to be by myself and not to be with other people. And I guess I was just curious, like, like you said, that the monastery in some ways are our relationships, but also I guess there is that balance of being practicing and being by yourself,
Right.
like, and then when that time comes that you're by yourself and maybe you didn't really choose for that to happen, to be open to that, that this is something that's it's really a gift that's being given to me, but sometimes I don't want it.
Right. It's difficult.
I don't want to be alone.
Yeah.
I don't want to be
right.
Like, and sometimes I think I get too in my head. And so I'm just kind of noticing that it's just, it's such a journey and it's such a process. And
absolutely.
I feel like I'm in kindergarten most of the time.
Sue, I do too. Absolutely. I was just telling somebody that yesterday. Yeah. I feel like I'm in. Actually, the only difference there is that I've sort of like maybe been in kindergarten a little longer or something, But yeah, I think it's true. Yeah. And Ajahn Chah, it's really quite amazing how Ajahn Chah talks about his own practice. It's so beautiful. That he talks about exactly what you just said, it unfolding over a long period of time and practice and inquiry, and that the difference really for him is that he was very diligent about it. Very like, okay, here's this place where I'm caught. Here's this place. Now, can I investigate this? Can I look and see what's going on? So I don't know that I would say by ourselves, but with ourselves, kind of, can we know our own experience so that whatever the response is, it's coming out of a quality of kindness and spaciousness internally, and at least a bit of clarity. Yeah. Anything else urgent? One more, and then we'll go on.
So I'm not sure how exactly to phrase this, but something about, cultivating relationships, but also having boundaries I'd like you to speak more about, but I'm kind of struggling to kind of get a coherent thought or question around it.
Just be incoherent for one more sentence, just kind of hang out a little bit with your question. What, do you have an example, or I don't mean to go that you should be personal about it, but what.
Well, I think like just balancing between relationships that could potentially be unhealthy and figuring out, even if they're family or people you're stuck at work with, like how to kind of set those boundaries while maintaining this balance of, I want to be in this moment and with what I'm feeling, but I also don't really want to feel it for too long.
Well, it might be that if I'm in this moment and what I'm feeling. I had a really interesting experience. I think I reported it at one time in one of my talks, that I was really struggling with one of my family members, and I was really struggling to try to kind of be with my own experience and, be kind of spacious with it. And I woke up in the middle of the night one night and I went, wait a minute, I'm angry. I'm angry. And I was like trying to be all very holy and spacious about it, which in my own mind did not include allowing the experience of feeling angry. So as I allow the experience of feeling angry, that was very useful. And then I had the help of another person. I spoke to my husband about it, and he was able to help me find even more spaciousness about it, so that I was able to respond with a very clear no. But it was a different kind of no than either like, oh, I'm really being holy and nice and better than you, and I don't know what your problem is. And, and or blasting somebody. But it was a very clear no that actually was very productive. So that the action, the clarity of the experience actually led to a very clear boundary. But sometimes we try to establish a boundary as a way of not feeling what we're feeling, because it's just really unpleasant. That's what I was initially doing. I was sort of like, I was really establishing, as Liz is pointing out, I was actually establishing a boundary with myself. I was not allowing the fullness of my own experience. Therefore, if I'm bad when I'm feeling angry, so are you. Huh? So now we have a real setup for having a whole bunch of relational struggles, because now there's an experience that I can have. Well, actually, I don't have it because I'm just much more holy than that. And furthermore, I'm much holier than you are, and I can tell you that you're wrong to have that experience, which is kind of more how it would unfold if I don't really know what's going on internally. Could be anything. Could be joy. Could be fear. Could be sadness. Cheer up. It's just, as Charlotte is pointing to, could be anything that it's unpleasant. It's difficult being with this. And so I want to fix something out there so that I don't have to feel uncomfortable. But it doesn't mean we don't set boundaries. It's just that the boundary comes from a different place. Okay. I know there are going to be more questions. Let me continue with a little bit more, and it looks like let me continue with a little bit more. Not to worry, I'm actually teaching more this summer. If we don't finish all of this summer, we will finish it tonight we'll finish it sometime. Jeff, when he spoke a couple of weeks ago, but we both spoke about that second arrow, the place where we have something painful that happens, and that we kind of go immediately to the second arrow where we start to either try to fix it out there. In my case, that example that I was just giving, where I try to fix myself, I'm trying to kind of, without even really consciously knowing quite what's going on, I'm judging myself and trying to fix myself because anger isn't holy enough, or maybe it would be something like anger isn't self-righteous enough, with me being somehow better than somebody else. So this is the Buddha. He says, the first and second arrows, he says, just as if they were to shoot a man with an arrow, which is the difficulties of life, and right afterward were to shoot him with another one, so that he would feel the pain of two arrows. In the same way, when touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person sorrows, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught. So he feels two pains, both the physical and the mental, both what's happening externally and also the kind of internal angst that we kind of go into, that proliferating mind that we go into. So the second arrow is clinging, is hanging on to that first arrow in some particular way. Ajahn Chah uses the example of holding on to a hot iron, that we actually hold on and it burns, it hurts. I had an interesting image or story that came up about my own experience that I'll share with you. One time when I was a little girl, I went to Girl Scout camp. And it was my first experience at camp, and I didn't have really very many supplies. And so my mother sent me with a little metal measuring cup. It was, about like this, but it was metal. It had a little handle, and it was my cup that I was taking to drink out of. And one day, they were offering us hot cocoa. And I was very excited about getting hot cocoa because I really liked hot cocoa. And so I very carefully and diligently put my little fingers into the handle, the small little handle of the measuring cup, so that they were nice and snug in there. And so I reached out my cup and, asked somebody to pour the hot cocoa. Some of you already are ahead of me. Asked them to pour the hot cocoa into my cup, and indeed my little fingers were so stuck in the cup that it burned, it hurt, because here I am right, snug, right stuck into the edge of this measuring cup. And the Buddha is saying, when we hang on to the pain itself, the stress itself, without the capacity to be aware of it, it's like putting our little fingers into that metal measuring cup, that we're kind of stuck there. And then we're like feeling, really a lot of pain. And then, of course, we can add on top of that judgment and theories about whether or not I should do whatever it is that I just did that is causing even more pain. And then, of course, we can add on top of that more judgment and theories about having judgment and theories about, and it can kind of go on endlessly, and the stress and the suffering just continues. So what the Buddha is directing us toward is a kind of spaciousness of awareness that we can notice our experience, that we can notice a hot teacup. He said, but Ajahn Chah has the image of holding a hot teacup, and maybe that's a better image than even mine. He has the image of holding a hot teacup, and that the tea is too hot to drink, and that we put it down a bit. We're still aware of it. We still have an intention of relating to it, but we have a capacity in our awareness to know it rather than being so up close and so tight, and indeed so kind of collapsed inside of the difficulty that there's no freedom of movement. You know what I mean when I talk about being collapsed inside of a difficulty where it seems like there's just no spaciousness, there's no room at all. It's like everything is this, everything is my rage, everything is, my grief is just everything, my rage is just everything. And so the challenge of our practice is to cultivate some spaciousness so that we can know what's arising, but not be kind of inside of it or so hanging out so close to it or clinging to it so closely that we are insisting that be different in order for me to relate to it. That we're cultivating the capacity to be with our experience. So the invitation of our practice is to look to see, what are we holding on to tightly? Are we insisting on the pleasant somewhere? Do we have a perception or a story or a narrative? So notice that in my experience with my relative, when I woke up and realized that I was angry, that I was sort of holding on to, unconsciously, I wasn't doing it consciously, I was unconsciously holding on to a view that I could not, A, feel how angry I was, and B, respond with that, with the energy of that, with the strength of that, with that place of saying no. So that it was not conscious, it was just implicit, and it was, it took kind of that kind of moment in the middle of the night where we sometimes see things more clearly than we do in the middle of the day to realize, oh, that's what's happening. Oh, right, okay, well, I can be with being angry. So the Buddha invites us not to cultivate a practice where we have to fix those things out there, but to cultivate a new relationship with relational stress. So a new relationship with our own relational stress. A new relationship with suffering that allows us to respond in wholesome ways rather than to be controlled by our likes, our dislikes, our historical conditioning, and the likes and dislikes and historical conditioning and behaviors of other people. So that my happiness no longer becomes dependent on my own conditioning or how other people live and behave and think and navigate the world. So the invitation of our practice and of the first of the Four Noble Truths is to know deeply and experientially the truth of dukkha, to cultivate the capacity to know the experience of stress. Again, it seems counterintuitive. Relationship stress, to know what it feels like to be uncomfortable here. The first step. The second step is to look to see if there are any second arrows flinging about. And the third step really involves letting go of those second arrows as we cultivate the capacity to be with the first one, with some wisdom and discernment. So we release identification, as in, there's something wrong with me. We release identification as in there's something wrong with you. We release our ideas about how things are supposed to be right now. And we relax into the flow of this very human life, these very human experiences, and these very human relationships. And again, we could just notice how quickly we move to, there's something wrong with me, there's something wrong with you. I have to fix this. I can't be with this. If I am with this, the world will fall apart. It's not true, but that's what our practice invites us to cultivate. I'm going to pause there for another minute. Any other questions that come up, or comments, or objections? Again, the objections are valuable too, just because, the mind, it's like, this is kind of a weird teaching, It's so different from what we ordinarily think. Anybody else want to offer a question or a comment or? Yeah.
Can't there actually be something like going on with you, or something's going on with them,
Right.
but maybe you don't know exactly what it is. But I understand what you're saying as far as being curious about the first arrow, because if you don't get the first arrow, then if there is a second arrow, like if there's something going on with you, how are you going to know that if you don't know the first arrow? So maybe you have to drop that until you know what that first arrow is.
Right.
But then sometimes you might have to investigate that.
Indeed.
No? Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So I think the Buddha would say the awareness is to know this is stress. It is different, though, from saying this is stress. This is painful. First arrow. First arrow. This is painful. To the move that we make, that we say, therefore something is wrong. And that's where the Buddha is inviting us to tease that one apart. One of the things that my husband, when I was sitting with that dilemma, was very helpful in helping me to see, was that the thing I was most angry about, the behavior, the response that was coming toward me, was actually directed and fueled by fear. My husband read an email, he handed it back to me, he said, "They are afraid." I was like, right. There wasn't anything wrong with feeling afraid. How it was manifesting was causing me a great deal of stress. Okay? There wasn't anything wrong with me either not noticing my anger, A, or B, noticing my anger. There just are ways that one can be more or less skillful. So if I respond to the kind of wonkiness that's coming toward me by just, I don't like this, and I kind of blast back, or alternately get very holy and disconnected, there's no way there's any relationship that's going to happen there, nor any healing, any even potential healing of the fear that is being directed toward me. But it isn't that anybody is wrong. They may be behaving in a very unwholesome and very unskillful way, which is a different kind of thing. In my more spacious moments, there are certain politicians, some I actually have a harder time than others, and not necessarily our president, but there are some politicians that I actually can cultivate a great deal of compassion for by opening my awareness and having a sense of, where does this come from? Now, it's still incredibly unskillful behavior in my view, and not something I want to support, but nevertheless, it's the experience of being with someone who is suffering. Okay? So the distinction I think that the Buddha would make is about the wrongness of it. Can we be kind? Can we see what's happening? Can we open and inquire and be curious? What is this and what's needed? Okay? And we start with ourselves. Yeah. Yeah, I think Dan was next to you. That's right. We have to have a question on this side.
So you said Buddha said something like, or the idea is, understand what stress is. But to me, I guess the understanding is, he's not saying understand what your stress is, understand what stress is. And it seems like it's a big opportunity to really think about the fact that everybody,
Beautiful.
it's not get in touch with your stress. It's the fact that if you're born as a human being, you are a
Feeling
medium for this reality, that this is just part of the experience. And that
Right.
Every single person on the face of the earth has something going on that is just a variation of
Right.
some kind of that. And so maybe bringing that understanding to your interactions with other people, you're less likely to say, okay, this is my thing, this is your thing.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, we're sort of involved in this
This being
reality
this
of,
being human.
we're all sort of oscillating back and forth constantly between too much of this, too little of that. Oh, I've got this, I hope it doesn't go away. Something
Right.
like that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, great. Perfect. This being human. This being human. Yeah.
I had my question clearly, and then I just was very caught with Dan's comment. So now I'm in a new moment here. But if I can come back a little bit, it was something about not hearing that question, where is it coming from, as permission for yourself or for another to do harm. To understand where someone's coming from, if they're committing murder, it is understanding, it is compassion, and it is that idea that every one of us is under stress. There are ways that stress can be expressed that are not acceptable,
Right.
that cause harm. So there's some kind of dance there that's
Beautiful.
challenging. And I use an extreme example of murder, but
Yeah.
it gets way trickier when it's just something somebody does or says, and it's like, well, I understand where that's coming from, but where do I stand with that myself? What's the first arrow? How does that make me feel or experience? Then what am I doing about that? Like about me, about them? And it can get very, very tricky in there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In a way, I want to just leave it at that because it's true. It is tricky. It is hard because we could go from, on one side, the sense of like, I have to fix this, I have to fix this, to flop to the other side and say, whatever. And that's not what the Buddha's saying either. He's talking about really paying attention. What causes affliction? What doesn't cause affliction? Really paying attention. But he's also inviting us to cultivate the capacity to respond wisely and to do exactly what you're saying, to really navigate that dance, if you will, with some wisdom and kindness for all beings, and recognize that we're not going to, as Dan is saying, that we're not going to fix the planet, But there might be something in a relationship that I need to speak or do or invite. It's tricky, isn't it? Because we can be very convinced that I can be very convinced that I know how you need to do whatever. you know. And so to really look clearly, where is that coming from? Is there actual harm? You know, anyway, yeah. Yeah. So I think those two really do very much go together. Yeah. I do have a guided meditation, which we're not going to have time for, so I will promise to bring that the next time, which is, well, I'm teaching again in 2 weeks, but I'm going to teach it. I'm going to do a different teaching because I want to teach on something that will, you know, be just before Charlene Green comes. So it'll be the time after that, which is the week after that. It's like 3 weeks. But let me read to you a couple things before we end. Well, let me also remind you also that Jeff, in his talk, talked about reactivity a couple weeks ago. He talked about knowing when our buttons are pushed, which is to say when we're in a state of agitation such that we're actually not in a spacious state. And that can we know when that is happening for us, and then our practice is to cultivate more ease in those moments before we act. The Buddha, this is from Ajahn Sucitto. The Buddha makes no moral judgment here. He does not tell us not to be this way or to cut it out. In fact, he doesn't even say we even are that way. He just says that there are these energies at work. Remember, the First Noble Truth points to the suffering that arises from trying to encompass existence in terms of self. This is what Dan was pointing to. As soon as we start saying we are this way, some way, and we should be another way, self-desire has slipped into our mind and has pushed us out of balance. So the language of the Buddhist teachings is deliberately impersonal. This way we don't get ashamed or defensive, and we are encouraged to calm our heart, to steady it and slow its movements. That's what I was just saying about the arousal of our nervous system. To calm our hearts, to steady it, to slow its movement. The calming takes the edge off of this thirst of wanting things to be different, and is one of the essential aims of meditation. Based on that, we have a greater possibility to investigate the way things are in a more open and objective light. However, if we cultivate attention to what is arising in the present, in whatever form the present moment takes, our mind begins to reveal its own buried treasures, sensitivity, confidence, and serenity. In other words, we establish a thirst-free, a clinging-free relationship to the senses. We can hold that little cup without, getting kind of caught even more deeply in suffering. And that gives us both poise and understanding. The Buddha isn't telling you to discard your desires out of aversion to them. Letting go of attachment isn't about rejecting your wants and feelings in the sense of getting rid of the trash or throwing cold water on a fire. A more accurate image is allowing your tea to cool rather than drinking it from an overly hot cup and burning your lips and mouth. Think of it as releasing the energetic hold your desires have on your mind. Release arises spontaneously from mindful observation and wise reflection. So that's the first half of my talk, and the other half is the guided meditation. We'll just do that another night. So hang in there. But just, kind of take that and, inquire a little bit into your own relationships. What might it be like to bring a little bit more, to bring awareness just a little bit more back home? Just a little bit more back home. Okay. So thank you. We'll end for tonight.